Yesterday, May 14th, 2026, the most important thing that came out of the first bilateral session between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing is not what anyone expected walking into that room. It is not trade. It is not the 200 Boeing 737 MAX jets China agreed to purchase in what is arguably the most expensive diplomatic handshake in aviation history. It is not the commitment to buy 600,000 barrels of American crude oil per day, worth approximately $10 billion per month at current prices. It is not Xi's explicit warning to Trump that Taiwan is his number one agenda item, and that mishandling it could push both nations toward what he called clashes and even conflicts. All of those developments matter. All of them will reshape specific bilateral relationships for years. But none of them is the sentence that changes the entire strategic architecture of the Iran conflict in a single bilateral session. The sentence that changes everything is this. Both nations agreed, officially, on the record, in the same room, that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, and that the Strait of Hormuz must be reopened for global energy. Read that sentence with the full weight it carries. China, Iran's largest oil customer. The country purchasing approximately 1.6 million barrels of Iranian crude every single day. The country that has provided diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council. The country that has been the economic lifeline sustaining the Islamic Republic through the most intense external pressure campaign of its 47-year history. Just sat down with the United States of America and co-signed two of America's core red lines on Iran simultaneously. Not one, both. No nuclear weapon. Strait must reopen. That is not strategic ambiguity. That is not neutrality. That is not the carefully calibrated, both sides positioning that China's foreign ministry language has been producing since February 28th. That is Beijing explicitly aligning itself with the American position on the two issues that Ahmad Vahidi's IRGC command structure has been treating as non-negotiable, as institutional survival conditions since the ceasefire began. And Iran's response to that alignment, launched within hours of the summit's first session producing this outcome, was to initiate a 5-day military exercise called Martyr Commander. One country just changed the entire diplomatic battlefield of this conflict. The other country named a military exercise after dead people. That asymmetry tells you everything you need to know about where this conflict goes next. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why yesterday's Beijing summit outcome is the most consequential single development since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th, and why it changes the IRGC's survival calculation in ways that no military action has yet achieved, you need to understand the energy mathematics that make China's position not just diplomatically significant, but economically devastating for the IRGC's war chest. And you need to understand the specific institutional logic that makes Vahidi's command structure simultaneously the most dangerous actor in the theatre and the most structurally vulnerable to the pressure that Beijing's position change introduces. Here is where things stand today. As of yesterday, China imports 11.6 million barrels of crude oil per day, a record high as of 2025. Iran has been supplying approximately 1.6 million of those barrels per day. Roughly 1 in every 7 barrels China burns, delivered at a deep discount because Iran has no alternative buyer capable of absorbing that volume, and no other major customer willing to accept the secondary sanctions risk that purchasing Iranian crude requires. That discount arrangement, estimated at $8 to $10 per barrel below Brent pricing, has been Iran's economic survival mechanism throughout the blockade period. It is the channel through which the IRGC has converted its trapped oil into the cash that pays its soldiers, funds Hezbollah's operations, finances Houthi ammunition resupply, sustains its domestic suppression apparatus, and maintains the fiction that the regime has viable economic alternatives to accommodation with Washington. China has simultaneously been purchasing American crude, now committed at approximately 600,000 barrels per day in yesterday's session, worth close to $10 billion per month at current prices. And Xi Jinping publicly stated during the summit's first session that China opposes the militarization of the Strait of Hormuz and any Iranian attempt to charge tolls on commercial shipping transiting the waterway. Beijing is simultaneously paying Washington more for oil while publicly opposing the specific mechanism Tehran has been using to extort the global shipping industry through its toll charging scheme and its Persian Gulf Strait Authority email clearance requirement. That is not a subtle diplomatic adjustment. That is China exiting the room where it has been standing between Iran and the full consequences of American economic and military pressure. And the energy mathematics of that exit, when they fully land in the IRGC's war chest accounting, are more devastating to Iran's endurance capacity than any airstrike the American military has conducted in this conflict. Now let me give you the precise numbers, because the energy mathematics are where China's leverage actually lives, and where the IRGC's vulnerability is most quantifiable and most irreversible once it fully manifests. China imports 11.6 million barrels per day. Iran supplies 1.6 million of those barrels. The discount at which Iran sells, $8 to $10 per barrel, below Brent, is the discount of a supplier that has absolutely no alternative buyers at comparable volume and no leverage to demand better pricing from the one buyer it has left. Iran cannot walk away from China. China can walk away from Iran. China's strategic petroleum reserves sit at approximately 1.4 billion barrels as of late 2025, representing roughly 4 months of total import coverage. Over a 6 to 12-month timeline, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Brazil, Russia and the United States could collectively absorb most of the 1.6 million barrels per day that China currently sources from Iran. Saudi Arabia alone, with the East-West pipeline operating, and Aramco at elevated production levels, has significant additional capacity it has been holding back pending a normalized market environment. The UAE, with the Fujairah pipeline at full operational capacity, is already moving 1.5 million barrels per day around the strait, entirely outside Iranian interdiction range. The alternative supply architecture exists. China's strategic reserve buffer exists. What has been missing, until yesterday in the Great Hall of the People, was the political will to deploy the leverage that the mathematics describe. That political will is now arriving, not overnight, not in a single summit session, but arriving with sufficient public clarity that every financial model the IRGC has been running for its endurance calculation now requires a downward revision of the timeline it was predicting. Now let's dissect what the Martyr Commander exercise actually tells you about the IRGC's current strategic posture. Because the naming of a military exercise is itself a strategic communication, and this particular name communicates something very specific about the internal state of the organisation conducting it. Military exercises are named for operational objectives, when the organisation conducting them is confident and focused outward on the adversary. Military exercises are named for martyred commanders, when the organisation conducting them is focused inward, on its own institutional legitimacy and the loyalty of its own personnel. Martyr Commander does not communicate anything to the United States Navy about the IRGC's tactical doctrine, its weapons employment procedures, its command and control protocols, or its escalation thresholds. It communicates to the IRGC's own soldiers, officers, and regional commanders that the current leadership stands in the tradition of revolutionary martyrdom, and that fighting in the current conditions carries the same institutional legitimacy as fighting in the Iran-Iraq war, in the proxy campaigns across Lebanon and Yemen, in every operation that produced the martyred commanders the exercise's name invokes. That is a loyalty reinforcement communication. It is the kind of institutional messaging an organisation produces when its internal cohesion is under stress from the same forces producing its external difficulties. Economic strangulation reduces salaries. Battlefield defeats reduce morale. Internal power consolidation reduces institutional trust across the factions that are losing influence to Vahidi's centralization. All three of those stress vectors are operating simultaneously inside the IRGC right now. The Martyr Commander exercise is the command's response to all three at once. It is not a military threat to the coalition. It is a loyalty performance for an organization whose internal solidarity cannot be assumed under current conditions. Now let's get into Ahmad Vahidi's power consolidation, because the specific moves he has made in the past several weeks represent a military coup that has progressed further inside the Iranian state than any public analysis of the nominal civilian government's statements would suggest. Vahidi has blocked President Pezeshkian from making cabinet appointments. He has deployed loyalists to monitor Foreign Minister IRGC's diplomatic contacts and to report any flexibility or concession that deviates from the IRGC's approved negotiating position back to the command. He has declared that under wartime conditions, all critical and sensitive positions will be managed directly by the Revolutionary Guard until further notice. The civilian president of Iran cannot appoint his own ministers, cannot conduct diplomatic negotiations without IRGC supervision, and cannot speak to the nominal supreme leader without going through the military council that surrounds Mojtaba Khamenei and controls his information flow. This is the command structure that yesterday's Beijing outcome has just placed in a strategic position Vahidi's institutional logic cannot navigate successfully. Here is why. The IRGC's survival strategy requires maintaining the war narrative. War justifies IRGC dominance of Iranian governance. War creates the conditions under which the IRGC's control of 40% of Iran's domestic economy, its telecommunications infrastructure, its port operations, its banking relationships, and its suppression apparatus is institutionally defensible. Peacetime accountability is the IRGC's existential threat, not American airstrikes. A negotiated peace that includes nuclear moratoriums, sanctions relief conditioned on nuclear compliance, and the reopening of the Strait to international commerce produces the question the IRGC cannot answer in a post-war environment. Why does a military organization control the national economy? What justifies its existence as the de facto governing authority of the Iranian state once the threat that justifies it has been resolved? Vahidi understands this. The Martyr Commander exercise is his answer. Keep the war going, keep the threat narrative alive, keep the IRGC indispensable. And China just made that strategy significantly more expensive to execute by co-signing the American red lines that the strategy depends on preventing from being enforced. Now let me walk you through China's three levers with the precision they deserve, because these are the mechanisms through which Beijing can accelerate the conflict's resolution in ways that the blockade and the military posture alone have not yet achieved on the administration's desired timeline. And each lever operates through a different channel of Iranian vulnerability, with a different time frame and a different degree of reversibility. The first lever is the reduction of Iranian oil purchases. Iran sells to China at deep discounts because it has nowhere else to go with the volume China absorbs. The 600,000 barrels per day of American crude committed in yesterday's session begins the substitution process a full reduction would require. Every barrel China purchases from the United States, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from Brazil, is a barrel not purchased from Iran. The substitution does not happen overnight. China's import infrastructure, its refinery configurations, its shipping logistics, and its existing Iranian purchase contracts all create inertia against rapid change. But the directional signal is now established publicly, on the record, in the same room as the American president. And directional signals in commodity markets, particularly signals from the world's largest single buyer of crude oil, do not stay theoretical for long. The moment Chinese oil traders, state-owned enterprise purchasing managers, and port logistics coordinators begin operationalizing the summit's directional signal, Iranian oil revenue projections start revising downward in the models Vahidi's economic advisors are running. Combined with the $500 million per day blockade loss, already compounding daily, the first lever's operationalization compresses the CIA's 3 to 4 month endurance window by a margin the IRGC's internal accounting will feel within weeks. The second lever is the withdrawal of China's diplomatic cover at international forums, unless Iran returns to serious nuclear negotiations. For months, China's UN Security Council vetoes alongside Russia have been the mechanism preventing international consensus around Iranian accountability from producing binding multilateral pressure. Xi's public statement opposing Iranian toll charging and the militarization of the Strait is the beginning of the erosion of that cover. When Beijing stops automatically blocking at the Security Council, the international legal and institutional environment around Iranian maritime conduct changes in ways that complicate every operational move the IRGC executes in the Strait. Ships from countries that were previously deterred from challenging Iranian toll demands by the absence of a unified international position now have the standing to transit with the backing of a Security Council that is no longer divided on whether Iranian toll charging constitutes a violation of international maritime law. The second lever does not require China to do anything active. It requires China to stop doing something it has been doing reflexively. And the stopping of reflexive diplomatic cover, once established as Beijing's new default position, is far more durable than active support would be, because it aligns with China's actual commercial interests in an open strait rather than against them. The third lever is the one that would rewrite the rules of naval power in the strait entirely. The People's Liberation Army Navy escorting Chinese flag convoys through the Strait of Hormuz. A planned frigate shepherding a Chinese tanker convoy would simultaneously signal Beijing's refusal to pay Iranian transit tolls, its refusal to accept a US-only security framework in the waterway, and its assertion of independent naval presence in a theatre the American blockade has effectively administered as an exclusive American operational zone. This would not be a hostile act toward the United States. In the context of yesterday's summit agreement, it would be a joint enforcement of the agreed position that the strait must remain open to international commerce, conducted through Chinese naval assets, rather than requiring additional American naval presence in a theatre already at maximum sustainable deployment. This is the seismic option, less likely in the immediate term than levers 1 and 2, but the fact that the summit produced public agreement on the strait's reopening, before the question of who enforces that reopening has been definitively resolved, means that lever 3's eventual deployment has a diplomatic foundation that would not exist without yesterday's specific outcome. Now let's get into the IRGC's actual maritime doctrine in the strait. Because understanding what the Martyr Commander exercise is likely rehearsing requires understanding the doctrine that constitutes the IRGC's last remaining operational card in the Hormuz theatre. The IRGC's maritime doctrine was never designed to win a conventional naval engagement. Its entire operational architecture was built around a different and more achievable objective: raise the cost of transit through the strait high enough that commercial shipping refuses to enter the waterway, regardless of what the military outcome of any specific engagement would be. The IRGC does not need to sink an aircraft carrier to achieve its strategic objective. It does not need to defeat a destroyer in a sustained engagement. It needs to sink insurance rates in London, Singapore, and New York to the point where the actuarial mathematics of voyage insurance make strait transit commercially unviable for cargo companies whose ships cannot operate without coverage. Fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles threatening tankers at close range without warning, appearing from coastal caves and island geography before radar acquisition can provide sufficient response time. Mines in the navigable channels that raise the probability of hull damage to levels marine underwriters cannot insure at commercially viable premium rates. Shore-based NOR, missiles with a 100-mile range that can engage tankers before they enter the strait's narrowest 21-mile section, from positions the attacking force never needs to expose to counterattack. Shahad drone swarms that cargo companies and their insurers cannot dismiss as unlikely, given what the IRGC has already demonstrated it is willing to deploy against UAE oil infrastructure during a nominal ceasefire. That combination does not need to produce a high rate of ship destruction to be strategically effective. It needs to produce a high enough probability of engagement in the commercial risk calculation that insurance underwriters withdraw coverage from strait transits, making every commercial voyage through the waterway financially impossible, regardless of the ship captain's willingness to take the physical risk. This is the mechanism that has produced the Qatar LNG halt, the Cargill and Ghost Town terminals, the 230 trapped non-Iranian tankers, and the 2 to 3 year elevated price horizon Qatar's energy ministry has projected. And it is the mechanism that the American kill chain, the 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan, the B-1B training sorties over the eastern Mediterranean, the CENTCOM blockade enforcement architecture, and France's Tigre attack helicopters are all specifically positioned to defeat, by making the cost per IRGC boat of executing the doctrine higher than the commercial value that doctrine's execution could plausibly generate for the regime. The French Tigre helicopter contribution deserves more detailed analysis than most coverage provides, because it adds a specific layer to the coalition's defensive architecture that addresses the economics problem at its most fundamental level. France's Tigre attack helicopter carries a 30mm cannon and rocket pods, and was specifically tested against Iranian-type drone threats during UAE-based exercises in March 2026. The Tigre's effectiveness against heavy UAVs like the Shahed systems Iran addresses the cost economics problem that the IRGC's drone swarm strategy was specifically designed to exploit. When the IRGC launches Shahed one-way attack drones against commercial shipping or Gulf infrastructure, the defensive architecture faces a cost per engagement asymmetry, where the interceptor costs more than the drone being intercepted. The Phalanx close-in weapon system and standard missile interceptors on American destroyers are capable against drone threats but consume weapons inventory at rates that favour the IRGC's attrition calculus, when the drones cost $100,000 each, and the interceptors cost a multiple of that. The Tigris 30mm cannon engages the same Shahed drone at a cost per round that eliminates that asymmetry entirely. The Tigris does not consume a standard missile to engage a Shahed. It consumes cannon rounds. The cost structure removes the economic incentive from the IRGC's drone swarm attrition strategy at the specific engagement level, where the strategy is most effective. France showed up late to the conflict's coalition, but the capability it brought when it arrived is precisely calibrated to the threat category that represents the IRGC's most cost-effective remaining operational option. The AC-130 gunship platform deserves attention in the context of the Martyr Commander exercise's likely rehearsal focus, because it represents a capability the current IRGC doctrine was not specifically designed to operate against. The AC-130 is a side-firing weapons platform built on the C-130 Hercules airframe. It carries a combination of 25mm, 40mm, and 105mm weapon systems that fire from the aircraft's left side, while it maintains a pylon-turn orbit around the target area below. This configuration allows it to deliver continuous precision fire against surface targets from an orbiting position that keeps the target area permanently in its weapons engagement zone, without the need for strafing passes that fixed-wing attack aircraft require. Against fast attack boats operating from coastal caves and tunnel entrances in the Strait's northern approach geography, an AC-130 in a loiter orbit over the sortie assembly area can engage boats as they emerge from cover before they have reached the speed and dispersal geometry the IRGC's swarm doctrine requires to be effective. The doctrine assumes the emergence from coastal cover is the moment when the attacking force has maximum momentum, and the defending force has minimum targeting clarity. An AC-130 that has been orbiting the emergence point before the sortie begins inverts that assumption. The emerging boats are the ones entering an established engagement orbit, rather than the orbiting aircraft being surprised by emerging boats. The 105mm howitzer round the AC-130 carries has sufficient kinetic energy to disable a fast attack boat at direct hit ranges with a single round. The 40mm Bofors cannon engages targets at rates that allow multiple simultaneous contacts to be serviced within a single orbit. If the Martyr Commander exercise is rehearsing the coordinated sortie of fast attack boats from multiple coastal positions in a time-compressed swarm execution, the AC-130 in loiter orbit over those positions during the sortie window is the answer the rehearsal was not designed to defeat. Now let's talk about Russia's 1,560 drone attack, because the scale of what happened on the night of May 13th going into May 14th is the single largest aerial assault of the entire Ukraine-Russia war, and its timing delivers a strategic communication no military analyst can dismiss as operational coincidence. Ukrainian President Zelensky confirmed the attack involved over 1,560 strike drones launched in coordinated waves. Ukrainian drone monitoring services recorded 168 separate Shahed-type drone tracks at a single moment during the attack's peak. 19 Ukrainian regions were struck simultaneously, targeting railway infrastructure, port logistics facilities, and residential areas in a saturation campaign specifically designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defences whose intercept geometry and engagement protocols have been optimized for the smaller scale, nighttime attack patterns that characterized earlier phases of the war. Zelensky identified the timing explicitly and publicly. The assault began the same day Air Force One touched down at Beijing Capital International Airport. He called it deliberate, a message from Putin to NATO delivered at the precise moment the world's two most powerful nations were conducting their first bilateral summit in a decade. From a purely military standpoint, Russia is testing whether daytime saturation, attacks at this scale, can overwhelm Ukrainian air defense systems by presenting engagement geometry the system's intercept protocols were not calibrated for. But from a strategic communication standpoint, the timing is the message. Putin launched his war's largest drone assault, 1,560 aircraft simultaneously across 14 regions. On the day Beijing and Washington were sitting in the same room co-signing red lines on Iran, discussing Taiwan arms sales, and committing to increased bilateral crude oil trade. The communication Putin is delivering is that Russia can produce maximum military pressure at a moment when American attention and analytical bandwidth are concentrated on Beijing, and that the constraint on Russian escalation is not American military capacity, but American political will to respond across multiple simultaneous theatres. The India Agni-Vig ballistic missile test preparation is the development in this entire picture that is receiving the least coverage in proportion to its strategic significance. And the disproportion is entirely a product of the Iran-Russia-Ukraine-China convergence consuming analytical resources that would otherwise be focused on the Indo-Pacific nuclear balance. 1 year after Operation Sindoor, the 4-day India-Pakistan air war that produced the most significant conventional conflict between nuclear-armed powers in the modern era, India is preparing to test fire the Agni-V ballistic missile. The claimed capability, if confirmed in testing, includes a range of 10,000 kilometers, which places every major city on Earth within the Agni-V's potential strike radius from Indian territory. It carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, meaning a single missile launch can simultaneously deliver nuclear warheads to multiple separate targets across a dispersed geographic area. If those specifications are confirmed, India joins the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom in the exclusive tier of nuclear powers with MIRVed intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is not a marginal nuclear capability improvement within an existing deterrent posture. It is a qualitative transformation of India's strategic deterrence that arrives in a security environment already destabilized by Operation Sindoor's legacy. Pakistan's 13,000 troops in Saudi Arabia. Pakistan's nuclear umbrella commitment to Saudi Arabia under the SMDA, and the ongoing India-Pakistan nuclear deterrence relationship that Operation Sindoor demonstrated is not as stable as pre-conflict assessments assumed. The Agni-V's test preparation, the SMDA deployment, the Hormuz crisis, the Russia-Ukraine war's escalation, and the Beijing summit are not separate stories. They are simultaneous chapters of the same story about a global security architecture that is being reorganized faster than the analytical frameworks built to understand it can process the changes. Now let's bring all three tracks together into the complete strategic picture of what yesterday actually represents. The financial track, China co-signing the US red line on Iranian nuclear weapons while committing to 600,000 barrels per day of American crude purchases, is the most significant single movement in the financial track since the blockade began. The IRGC's war chest calculation changes the moment Chinese oil purchase reallocation from Iranian to American, and Gulf supply becomes operationally real. China's 1.4 billion barrel strategic reserve provides 4 months of buffer during the transition, meaning Beijing can begin the reallocation without facing its own energy security crisis while the substitution completes. The 600,000 barrels per day committed in yesterday's session signals the direction of the substitution process in a format, a bilateral presidential agreement on the public record, that Chinese oil procurement managers cannot ignore in their operational decision-making. Combined with the $500 million per day blockade loss already compounding, and with the well shutdown threshold at Karg Island approaching as loading operations have ceased and the 71-kilometre oil slick continues growing, the financial track is running out of the runway the CIA's 3 to 4 month endurance projection assumed. The military track, the Martyr Commander exercise, whatever its specific rehearsal content, is being conducted by an organisation whose conventional naval capacity has been destroyed, whose underground missile cities were eliminated in the May 7th and 8th counterattack, whose Shadow Fleet Gambit failed against FA-18 exhaust stack targeting, and whose Mosquito fleet of 500 to 1,000 fast attack boats represents the final military card available for straight operations. The 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan Air Base, the B-1B Lancer training sorties over the eastern Mediterranean, the airlift running at full swing, the AC-130's potential deployment against fast attack boats in coastal caves, France's Tigre helicopters with 30mm cannon capability against heavy UAVs, and the Operation Sledgehammer naming discussion at the Pentagon are all positioned to answer whatever the Martyr Commander exercise produces. The diplomatic track. Beijing has co-signed 2 American red lines on Iran in the first bilateral session of the Trump-Xi summit. The 3 levers China holds, oil purchase reduction, diplomatic cover withdrawal, and potential planned convoy escort, are now an active play rather than theoretical reserve. Pakistan has drawn a red line around Saudi Arabia with 13,000 troops and a nuclear arsenal. Saudi Arabia has confirmed strikes on Iraqi militias. The UAE is confirmed as the 3rd combatant through the Lavan refinery strike, and the internal Iranian political equation, with Vahidi blocking the civilian diplomatic faction from making concessions, is facing the pressure from the east that Chinese economic leverage represents, as a complement to the American military and economic pressure from the west and maritime south. Here is the honest assessment of where this situation stands today, the day after the summit's first session, and what yesterday's outcome means for the 30 days that follow it. The IRGC needs the war to continue because peacetime accountability is its existential threat. Vahidi's institutional logic is internally consistent and rational from the perspective of an organisation whose survival depends on the conflict narrative that justifies its dominance. But that logic runs directly against the interests of every other actor in the current landscape. The Iranian civilian population needs the war to end because they are the ones experiencing the food price inflation, the power blackouts, the medicine shortages, and the economic destruction the blockade's $500 million daily loss is producing. The Iranian civilian government needs the war to end because Pezeshkian's administration has been reduced to impotence by Vahidi's command structure and can only recover institutional relevance in a post-war environment where the IRGC's wartime powers are no longer constitutionally defensible. China needs the war to end because the Strait of Hormuz disruption is threatening its energy security and is being used by the United States as a demonstration of why dependence on Iranian oil creates unacceptable strategic vulnerability. The Gulf states need the war to end because the tanker gridlock is trapping their own oil exports inside the strait. The global economy needs the war to end because Qatar has projected 2 to 3 years of elevated prices even after the strait reopens. And the Trump administration needs the war to end on terms that include nuclear dismantlement because yesterday's session in Beijing has now given Washington the first genuine multilateral co-signature on that red line that has existed since the conflict began. Every major actor in the current landscape needs this war to end on terms that the IRGC's command structure will not authorize. And China just made the cost of the IRGC preventing that authorization measurably higher than it was 48 hours ago. The Martyr Commander exercise is the sound of an organization that understands what happened in Beijing yesterday and has no answer for it except noise. The 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan are not noise. The B-1B sorties over the eastern Mediterranean are not noise. The 1.4 billion barrel Chinese strategic reserve buffer that allows Beijing to begin the Iranian oil substitution process without energy security risk to itself is not noise. And the $500 million daily loss that is compounding while Iran runs an exercise named after martyrs is not noise. History does not record the names of the exercises. It records the outcomes of the decisions that produce them. Martyr Commander is a name. What comes next is the outcome. And yesterday's session in Beijing has just changed the balance of forces that determine what that outcome is.